The November wind howled across the endless Kansas prairie like a wounded animal carrying with it the bite of winter, and something darker, a restlessness that made even the cattle huddle closer to the barn. Inside his weathered cabin, Thomas McCready set down his leather-working tools and listened to the storm's fury. At 42, he had learned to read the prairie's moods, and tonight felt different. Dangerous. The lantern flame flickered against the assault of wind, finding every crack in the timber walls. Outside, his horses whinnied nervously, and somewhere in the distance, wolves answered with haunting calls that raised the hair on his neck. Thomas had lived alone on this remote homestead for 8 years, ever since consumption took his young wife, Sarah. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, to the rhythm of dawn chores and evening repairs, to conversations held only with his livestock and the occasional visit from neighboring ranchers. But tonight the prairie held secrets. The knock came just after 10 o'clock, soft, hesitant, almost lost in the wind's roar. Thomas frowned, setting aside the bridle he'd been mending. Neighbors didn't call this late, and certainly not in weather like this. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver, hanging from a peg by the door, fingers brushing the worn grip as he approached. "Who's there?" he called, voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. Silence answered, broken only by the storm's relentless assault. Then, so faint he almost missed it, came a child's voice. "Please." "We need help." Thomas's heart lurched. He quickly unlatched the heavy oak door and pulled it wide, revealing a sight that would haunt him forever. There, silhouetted against the storm-lashed darkness, stood a little girl no more than 8 years old. Her bare feet were blue with cold, her thin cotton dress torn and mud-stained, her dark hair whipping wildly in the wind. But it was what she carried that stopped his breath, a bundle of ragged blankets from which came the weak, mewling cry of an infant. "Sweet Jesus." Thomas breathed immediately, stepping aside. "Get in here, child. Quickly now." The girl hesitated, her wide brown eyes darting past him into the cabin's warm interior. Fear warring with desperate need. She was clearly terrified, but the baby's cries grew more urgent, and finally, survival won out. She stumbled across the threshold on legs that shook with exhaustion and cold. Thomas slammed the door against the howling wind and turned to study his unexpected visitors. The little girl stood dripping on his rough-hewn floor, clutching the baby so tightly her knuckles showed white. Up close, he could see she was painfully thin, her face gaunt with hunger and hollow with an adult kind of worry that no child should carry. "Lord Almighty, what are you doing out in this storm?" Thomas asked gently, moving slowly so as not to startle her further. "Where's your family?" The girl's chin lifted with a stubborn defiance that reminded him painfully of Sarah. Mama didn't come home last night, or the night before." Her voice cracked and she swallowed hard before continuing. "Bobby's been crying something fierce. He's hungry, mister. Real hungry." Thomas felt his chest tighten. The baby Bobby couldn't be more than a few weeks old, his tiny face red and wrinkled, his cries growing weaker by the moment. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Mama said never tell strangers. She replied, but there was less conviction in her voice, now exhaustion beginning to override caution. "Smart, Mama," Thomas said with a slight smile. "Well then, I'm Thomas McCready, and this here's my home. I reckon that makes us neighbors, not strangers." He moved toward his small kitchen area, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Let's get some food in you both before we figure out the rest." He quickly heated milk in a small pot, testing the temperature against his wrist the way Sarah had shown him when they'd hoped for children of their own. The memory stung, but he pushed it aside. The girl watched his every move with wary eyes, ready to bolt despite the storm raging outside. "Here now," Thomas said, pouring the warm milk into a clean cloth and offering it to her. "This should help the little one." The girl's reserve crumbled at her brother's desperate cries. She accepted the makeshift feeding cloth and pressed it to the baby's lips. Bobby latched on immediately, sucking with the fierce determination of the truly hungry. Relief flooded the girl's face, and for the first time, she looked her actual age. "There's a good lad," Thomas murmured, watching the tiny boy feed. "What about you, young lady? When did you last eat?" The girl's eyes darted away. "Day before yesterday, I reckon. Maybe longer." Thomas's jaw tightened with controlled anger, not at her, but at whatever circumstances had brought a child to this state. He quickly prepared a plate of bread and cold beef, along with a cup of milk warmed, just as he'd done for the baby. "Eat slow now," he advised as she fell upon the food with barely contained desperation. "Your stomach's likely shrunken some." As she ate, Thomas studied her more carefully. Despite the dirt and exhaustion, she was clearly a pretty child, with intelligent eyes and delicate features. Her dress, though torn and stained, had once been well made. These weren't abandoned waifs from the streets. They came from a family that had known better times. "Can you tell me where you came from?" Thomas asked gently. "How far did you walk?" The girl swallowed a mouthful of bread before answering. "From town, I think, or near it. I got all turned around in the dark." Her voice grew smaller. "I saw your light from way off. Only light burning anywhere." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She'd walked miles in this weather, carrying a newborn guided only by his lantern. If she'd missed his homestead, she and the baby would have died on the prairie before dawn. "What about your pa?" he asked carefully. The girl's face closed off immediately, fear flickering in her eyes. "Ain't got one," she said quickly. "Just Mama and Bobby and me." But Thomas caught the slight tremor in her voice, the way her hand unconsciously moved to her shoulder. He'd seen that gesture before children who'd learned to flinch. His suspicions began to crystallize, but he kept his voice gentle. "Well then, you're safe here," he said simply. "Storm's too fierce to go anywhere tonight. We'll figure things out come morning." The girl nodded gratefully, her eyelids beginning to droop as warmth and food worked their magic. Bobby had finished feeding and was making small, contented sounds against her chest. "What's his full name?" Thomas asked, more to keep her talking than from curiosity. "Robert James," she said proudly. "Born on Halloween night 6 weeks ago exactly. Mama said he was a gift from the angels coming so close to All Saints' Day." Thomas did quick mental arithmetic. 6 weeks old, born on October 31st, that would make today December 12th, 1847. And if the girl was telling the truth about her mother being gone for 2 days, what about your mama's name? He pressed gently. The girl hesitated, then seemed to decide he'd earned some trust. "Elizabeth Morrison. But folks mostly called her Lizzie." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "She's real pretty, mister. Real smart, too. She wouldn't just leave us. Something bad must have happened." Thomas nodded, filing away every detail. Morrison wasn't a name he recognized, but that didn't mean much. Families came and went on the frontier, many leaving few traces of their passage. As if summoned by their conversation, the storm's fury suddenly intensified. Wind shrieked around the cabin like banshees, and something heavy crashed against the outer wall, probably a loose shutter or piece of debris. The girl jumped, clutching her brother tighter. "Just the storm, sweetheart," Thomas said calmly, though his own nerves were on edge. This was shaping up to be one of the worst blizzards he'd seen in years. "You picked a good night to find shelter." But even as he spoke, another sound cut through the wind's howl, long, mournful howls that made his blood run cold. Wolves, and they sounded close, too close. The girl heard them too, her eyes going wide with terror. "Are they? Will they?" "They won't get near the cabin," Thomas assured her, moving to check that his rifle was loaded and within easy reach. Wild things know better than to tangle with men and fire. Still, he made a mental note to keep the fire burning bright all night. Wolves grew bold in harsh winters, and the scent of humans and livestock would draw them closer. Having children in the cabin complicated everything. As the evening wore on, the girl who finally admitted her name was Annie Morrison gradually relaxed enough to tell him more of her story. Her mother had left 2 mornings ago, saying she was going to town to find work and would be back by evening. She'd done this before leaving Annie to care for Bobby, but never for more than a few hours. She didn't take nothing with her. Annie explained, rocking her sleeping brother. Not even her Sunday dress or her mama's ring. She always wore that ring, mister. Always. Thomas felt his unease deepen. A woman didn't abandon her children without taking her most precious possessions unless she hadn't planned to be gone long, or unless something had prevented her return. This work she was looking for? He said carefully. What kind of work did she do? Annie's cheeks colored slightly. Sewing mostly. Mending clothes for folks. Sometimes she'd help at the saloon serving food, but she didn't like it much. Said men got ideas when a woman was alone. Thomas's suspicions hardened into something darker. A young widow with a newborn desperate enough to work in saloons vulnerable to any manner of predators. The frontier was littered with such tragedies. Annie, he said gently, I need you to think real careful. Did your mama have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt her? The girl's face went very still, and Thomas saw her make a decision. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the storm. There was a man, she whispered. He used to come around sometimes when Mama thought I was sleeping. He'd bring bottles and they'd talk real quiet. But Mama didn't like him much, I could tell by how she held herself all stiff and scared. What did he look like? Big. Real big, with yellow hair and mean eyes. Had a scar right here. She traced a line down her left cheek. Mama called him Jake, but I heard him tell her once that wasn't his real name. Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. Jake Rawlings had to be. He was a drifter who worked sometimes for the larger ranches, had a reputation for being handy with his fists, and not particular about where he earned his money. Thomas had run him off his own property twice for stealing tools. If Jake Rawlings had taken an interest in a desperate young widow. Annie, Thomas said urgently, did this Jake ever hurt you or your mama? The girl's hand went unconsciously to her shoulder again, and Thomas saw a small bruise peeking out from her torn dress collar. Old anger, cold and familiar, began building in his chest. He grabbed me once, she admitted in a tiny voice. When Mama wouldn't give him what he wanted. Shook me real hard and said maybe she'd be more friendly if something happened to her babies. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. When was this? 3 days ago, right before Mama went to town. The timeline clicked sickeningly into place. Jake threatens the children. Lizzie Morrison goes to town, possibly to confront him, possibly to find protection or escape. She doesn't return, and now her children are alone on the prairie in the worst storm of the season. Mr. Thomas. Annie's voice was very small. Is Mama dead? Thomas looked into those wide, frightened eyes and felt his heart break a little. He'd learned long ago that frontier children grew up fast-faced harsh realities sooner than they should. But Annie was still just 8 years old, still deserved whatever comfort he could offer. I don't know, sweetheart, he said honestly. But I promise you, this come morning when the storm passes, I'll find out what happened to her. And until then, you and Bobby are safe here with me. Annie nodded solemnly, accepting his promise with the gravity of a much older person. She settled back against the chair, still holding her brother. And for a while they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. But Thomas's mind was already racing ahead to morning, to what he might find in town, to the questions he would ask and the men he might have to face. Because one thing was becoming crystal clear: whatever had happened to Lizzie Morrison, Jake Rawlings was at the center of it. And if that man had hurt a young mother and left her children to die on the prairie, Thomas McCready would make sure he answered for it. The storm raged until dawn, when it finally exhausted itself against the endless Kansas sky. Thomas had dozed fitfully in his chair rifle across his lap, waking every time the wolves howled or debris struck the cabin. Annie and Bobby had slept more peacefully curled together under Thomas's warmest quilt, the babies breathing steady and strong. As pale morning light filtered through the shutters, Thomas quietly stoked the fire and put coffee on to brew. The mundane actions helped steady his nerves as he planned the day ahead. First, he'd need to get the children settled and safe. Then, he'd ride to town and start asking questions about Lizzie Morrison. Annie stirred as the coffee's aroma filled the cabin, blinking up at him with eyes that looked older than they had the night before. "Good morning, sweetheart," Thomas said gently. "How's our little Bobby?" She sat up carefully, checking her brother with practiced efficiency. "He's good. Slept through the whole storm." Her voice was hoarse with sleep, but underneath Thomas detected a new note of determination. "Mr. Thomas, you meant what you said about finding Mama." "I did." He poured coffee for himself and warm milk for her. "But first, we need to get you both properly fed and cleaned up. Can't have you catching your death of cold." Annie accepted the milk gratefully, but her eyes never left his face. "If something bad happened to Mama, if she can't come back, what happens to Bobby and me?" The question hit Thomas harder than he'd expected. In the clear light of day, the reality of the situation was stark. Even if they found Lizzie Morrison alive and well, these children had no one else in the world. They were utterly dependent on the kindness of strangers, and Thomas knew all too well how scarce that commodity could be on the frontier. "Let's cross that bridge when we come to it," he said finally. "Right now, you're safe, and that's what matters." But Annie was too smart to be put off by platitudes. "Mr. Thomas, I need to know. If Mama's gone, will you send us to the orphanage? I heard tell they split up brothers and sisters sometimes." Thomas set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. The thought of these two children brave, frightened Annie, and innocent little Bobby being torn apart and sent to some grim institution made his chest tight with fury. "No," he said firmly. "That won't happen. You have my word." Annie's shoulders sagged with relief, and Thomas realized he'd just made a promise that would change his life forever, but looking at her grateful smile, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. After breakfast, Thomas saddled his strongest horse, a steady gelding named Buck, who could handle the muddy, storm-damaged roads. He left Annie and Bobby in the cabin with strict instructions to keep the fire burning and the door barred until his return. "If anyone comes calling while I'm gone, anyone at all, you don't open that door," he told her seriously. "You understand me?" Annie nodded, clutching Bobby protectively. "What if it's Mama?" "Your Mama would call out her name, wouldn't she? She'd say something only you would know." Thomas handed her his spare revolver, a smaller weapon that her small hands could manage. "Do you know how to use one of these?" "Mama taught me," Annie said quietly. Said a woman alone needed to know how to protect herself. Thomas felt another surge of respect for Lizzie Morrison. Whatever her circumstances, she'd tried to prepare her daughter for the harsh realities of frontier life. The ride to town took longer than usual, with Buck having to pick his way carefully around downed trees and washed-out sections of road. The storm had been even fiercer than Thomas had realized. Several homesteads he passed showed damage from wind and debris, and more than one family was outside surveying the destruction. Millbrook wasn't much of a town, just a main street with a general store, saloon, church, and a handful of other businesses serving the scattered farming and ranching community. But it was the only real settlement within 50 miles, and if Lizzie Morrison had come looking for work, this is where she would have ended up. Thomas started at the general store, where old Pete Hansen knew everyone within 100 miles and wasn't shy about sharing what he knew. Lizzie Morrison. Pete scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. "Pretty little thing, dark hair, came in here sometimes with a couple of youngsters." "That's her. You seen her recently?" Pete's expression grew troubled. "Matter of fact, I did. Day before yesterday looked like she'd been crying. bought some cornmeal and asked if I knew anyone needing sewing done. Desperate like, you know. Sayed she needed work real bad. Did you help her? Told her to try Martha's boarding house. Sometimes Martha takes in seamstresses during busy times. But Tom... Pete leaned closer, lowering his voice. She looked scared. Keep glancing over her shoulder like she expected trouble. Thomas's jaw tightened. What kind of trouble? Well, now that you mention it. Pete glanced around to make sure they were alone. Jake Rawlings was in here not an hour after she left. Asking the same questions you are. Had I seen her, where might she have gone? Something about the way he asked. Well, it didn't sit right with me. What did you tell him? Nothing. Pete said firmly. Told him I minded my own business and he'd be wise to do the same. He didn't like that much, got all red in the face and stormed out. Haven't seen him since. Thomas thanked Pete and headed for Martha's boarding house, a tidy 2-story building that catered to travelers and temporary workers. Martha herself was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who ran her establishment with military efficiency. Lizzie Morrison. Martha's face darkened. Poor child came to me day before yesterday, practically begging for work. Said she had 2 babies at home and needed money for food and medicine. Did you give her work? I tried to. Had some mending that needed doing, offered her a fair wage and a meal. But she never came back to collect either one. Martha's expression grew worried. It's not like her, Tom. That girl was desperate. She wouldn't have walked away from honest work. You know her well. Well enough. She's been coming to me off and on for months whenever she needed extra money. Good worker, never caused trouble. But she was scared of something especially lately. Thomas felt the familiar cold anger building in his chest. Martha, did Jake Rawlings come around asking about her? Martha's face went hard as granite. That piece of trash, he came sniffing around all right. Claimed he was looking for his woman and her bastard children. I told him in no uncertain terms that respectable women didn't associate with his kind. And if he bothered my guests again, I'd set Sheriff Coleman on him. What did he say to that? Got ugly about it. Said some things about what he'd do when he found her that, well, they're not fit to repeat. Martha shook her head grimly. Tom, if that girl's missing, Jake Rawlings is behind it. Mark my words. Thomas thanked Martha and headed for the sheriff's office, though he held little hope that Sheriff Coleman would be much help. The man was pushing 70 and more interested in keeping the peace than investigating crimes, especially those involving people on the margins of society. Sure enough, Coleman listened to Thomas's concerns with the air of a man humoring a persistent child. Now, Tom, you know how these drifting women are, Coleman said dismissively. Probably just moved on to the next town looking for better prospects. Happens all the time. Without her children. Thomas's voice was sharp with controlled anger. What kind of mother abandons a newborn baby? Coleman shrugged. The kind that gets herself in trouble with men like Jake Rawlings. Maybe she figured the babies would be better off without her. Thomas leaned forward, his hands flat on Coleman's desk. Those children nearly died on the prairie last night. The little girl walked miles in a blizzard carrying her baby brother looking for help. Does that sound like they were abandoned by choice? Something in Thomas's tone must have finally penetrated Coleman's indifference. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his chair. All right. I'll ask around, see if anyone else has seen her. But Tom, even if something did happen to her, what's it to you? You barely knew the woman. Thomas straightened, his decision crystallizing. Those children are under my protection now. And I mean to find out what happened to their mother. Coleman's eyebrows rose. Your protection, Tom? You can't just... I can, and I will. Thomas's voice brooked no argument. Those babies needed help, and I gave it. That makes them my responsibility. He left the sheriff's office with a growing sense of urgency. 3 people now had confirmed seeing Lizzie Morrison 2 days ago, and 3 people had mentioned Jake Rawlings asking after her. But no one had seen either of them since. Thomas made one more stop, the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Lizzie had sometimes worked serving food. The barkeeper, a thin man named Eddie, remembered her well. Sweet girl, Eddie said, polishing glasses with methodical precision. Always polite, never caused trouble with the customers. But she quit coming around maybe 2 weeks ago. Said it wasn't safe for her anymore. Safe how? Eddie glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. Jake Rawlings took a shine to her, if you know what I mean. Started getting possessive, claiming she was his woman. Lizzie was scared of him. Hell, we all were. Jake's got a mean streak wider than the Mississippi. Was he here 2 days ago? Yeah, he was here. Drinking heavy, asking everyone if they'd seen Lizzie. Getting more worked up by the hour. Eddie's voice dropped to a whisper. Tom, he was talking crazy. Saying if he couldn't have her, nobody could. Said he'd make sure she learned her place. Thomas felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. Where is he now? Don't know. He rode out yesterday morning, heading north toward the old Jameson place. That's been abandoned for years, perfect spot for a man who doesn't want to be found. Thomas thanked Eddie and stepped back into the weak December sunlight, his mind racing. The Jameson place was 15 miles north, an old homestead that had been abandoned after Indian troubles 5 years ago. If Jake Rawlings was holed up there, and if he had Lizzie Morrison with him, Thomas swung up onto Buck's back, his jaws set with grim determination. But as he prepared to ride north, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a troubling question. What if he was too late? What if Lizzie Morrison was already beyond help? And what would he tell Annie and Bobby then? The ride to the Jameson place took Thomas through some of the roughest country in the territory, rolling hills, thick with scrub oak and cedar, cut through by dry creek beds that turned into raging torrents during storms. The abandoned homestead sat in a natural hollow, hidden from casual view by a ring of hills and heavy timber. As Thomas approached, he could see why Jake Rawlings might have chosen this place. The main house was still structurally sound, though the windows were boarded up and the front porch sagged badly. More importantly, it was isolated. A man could hold someone here for weeks without being discovered. Thomas dismounted a quarter mile from the house and continued on foot, leading Buck quietly through the trees. His military training from the Mexican War served him well as he used every bit of available cover to approach unseen. The first thing he noticed was smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was definitely here. The second thing was a horse tethered behind the house, a big bay stallion that Thomas recognized as Jake Rawlings' mount. But it was the third thing that made his blood run cold, hanging from a line between 2 trees, like a macabre flag of surrender, was a woman's torn dress. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood. Thomas tied Buck securely and checked his weapons, his rifle, his Colt revolver, and the long knife he'd carried since his army days. If Jake Rawlings had hurt Lizzie Morrison, Thomas was prepared to end this permanently. He circled the house carefully, looking for the best approach. The front door was boarded shut, but the back door stood slightly ajar. Thomas could hear voices from inside, one deep and slurred with drink, the other higher, pleading. Please, Jake, just let me go back to my children. They need me. Bobby's just a baby. Thomas's heart leaped. Lizzie Morrison was alive. Your brats are probably dead by now. Jake's voice was thick with whiskey and cruelty. Left alone in this storm, hell, I'd be doing them a favor if I put them out of their misery. No. Lizzie's cry was anguished. They're smart children. They'll have found shelter somewhere. Someone will help them. Jake's laughter was ugly. Who's gonna help bastard children? You think folks around here give a damn about you and your spawn? Thomas had heard enough. He eased up to the back door and peered through the gap. The interior was dim, lit only by a small fire in the hearth, but he could see enough to make his jaw clench with fury. Lizzie Morrison sat tied to a wooden chair in the center of the room, her face bruised and swollen, her dress torn and bloodied. She was even younger than Thomas had imagined, probably no more than 25, with delicate features and dark hair that hung in tangled strands around her shoulders. Jake Rawlings stood over her, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a leather belt in the other. He was a big man, as Annie had described, well over 6 feet and broad through the shoulders, with dirty yellow hair and pale, mean eyes. The scar on his left cheek was more prominent than Thomas had expected, a puckered line that spoke of serious violence in his past. "You're going to learn to be grateful for what I'm offering you," Jake was saying, raising the belt threateningly. "A woman alone with 2 bastards. You got no choices left, Lizzie. Be nice to me, and maybe I'll let you see your babies again." Thomas stepped through the door, his rifle raised and steady. "Or maybe you'll let her go right now, and we'll call it even." Jake spun around, his face twisted with surprise and rage. "McCready, what the hell are you doing here? Returning stolen property," Thomas said calmly, though inside his heart was racing. "Step away from the lady, Jake." Jake's eyes darted around the room, calculating odds. "This ain't your business, Tom. Lizzie here owes me money, and we're just working out payment terms. Liar." Lizzie gasped, her voice hoarse but defiant. "I never owed you anything. You said you'd hurt my children if I didn't come with you." Thomas's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. "That true, Jake? You threaten children to get what you want. Them bastards ain't children," Jake snarled. "They're just another mouth to feed another burden on decent folks. World's better off without their kind." The casual cruelty in Jake's voice was more than Thomas could stand. But before he could respond, Jake suddenly lunged sideways, grabbing Lizzie's chair and using her as a shield while his free hand went for the gun at his hip. "Drop the rifle, Tom, or the whore gets a bullet." Thomas froze, his weapon still trained on Jake, but unable to get a clear shot. Lizzie whimpered in pain as Jake's arm tightened around her throat, the muzzle of his pistol pressed against her temple. "That's better." Jake grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk away, forget you ever saw me or her, and in a few days I'll let her go. Maybe. Can't do that, Jake. Then she dies and it's on your head." Thomas's mind raced, looking for an opening, any chance to take Jake down without risking Lizzie's life. But Jake was too experienced, too careful. He kept himself positioned so that any shot Thomas took would likely hit Lizzie as well. "You know what I think." Jake's voice took on a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier rage. "I think you got a soft spot for this little whore. Maybe you've been sampling the goods yourself, huh, Tom? Maybe you know exactly why she's so popular with the men in town." "Jake," Thomas's voice was a warning. "Oh, I bet you do. I bet you've been thinking about what it'd be like to have a woman again, even a used-up one with bastard children. Tell me, Tom, was she worth it?" Thomas felt control slipping away, red rage building behind his eyes. But before he could do something stupid, Lizzie herself acted. With a sudden, desperate movement, she threw her weight backward, tipping the chair and herself away from Jake's gun. In the split second of confusion that followed, Thomas fired. The rifle shot boomed through the small room, and Jake Rawlings spun around, clutching his right shoulder as blood poured between his fingers. His pistol went flying, landing somewhere in the shadows near the fireplace. But Jake wasn't finished. With a roar of pain and fury, he charged at Thomas, his left hand pulling a wicked-looking knife from his boot. Thomas had time to drop the rifle and draw his Colt, but Jake was on him before he could aim properly. They went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of both weapons. Jake was bigger and stronger, but Thomas had desperation on his side and the memory of Annie's frightened face when she'd spoken of this man's threats. The knife slashed toward Thomas's throat, and he barely managed to catch Jake's wrist, holding the blade inches from his skin. Meanwhile, Jake was trying to turn Thomas's own gun against him, using his weight advantage to slowly force the barrel toward Thomas's chest. "Well, should have minded your own business." Jake gasped, spittle flying from his lips. Now you're gonna die for a whore and her bastards." But Thomas had one advantage Jake didn't know about. His left hand was free, and in it was the long knife he'd carried since his army days. With a quick economical motion, he drove the blade up under Jake's ribs, angling toward the heart. Jake's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. His grip on the knife loosened, and Thomas rolled away just as Jake's body went limp. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Thomas's harsh breathing and Lizzie's quiet sobbing. Then Thomas forced himself to move, holstering his pistol and kneeling beside her overturned chair. "It's all right," he said gently, working at the ropes that bound her. "It's over now. Jake can't hurt you anymore." Lizzie looked up at him with eyes filled with pain and disbelief. Are you really here? Are my babies safe?" "They're safe," Thomas assured her, finally getting the last rope untied. "Annie was very brave. She got herself and Bobby to my cabin before the storm hit. They're waiting for you there." Lizzie tried to stand, but swayed dangerously, her legs too weak to support her weight. Thomas caught her gently, shocked at how little she weighed. "Easy now. When did you last eat?" I don't remember." 2 days, 3. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Jake said, he said my children were dead, that no one would help them. He lied." Thomas helped her to a more comfortable chair, as far from Jake's body as possible. "Annie's the smartest, bravest little girl I've ever met. And Bobby's healthy and strong. They're both fine, I promise you." Tears streamed down Lizzie's battered face. But for the first time since Thomas had found her, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than despair. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why did you come looking for me? You don't even know me." Thomas considered the question seriously. Why had he risked his life for a woman he'd never met? The answer, when it came to him, was simpler than he'd expected. "Because Annie asked me to," he said simply. "And because no child should lose their mother if there's anything I can do to prevent it." Lizzie stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand what manner of man would risk everything for strangers. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. I can never repay you for this." "No repayment needed," Thomas said firmly. "But we need to get you out of here. Can you ride?" Lizzie nodded, though Thomas could see the effort it cost her. Together, they made their way outside, where Thomas helped her onto Buck's back before swinging up behind her. As they rode away from the Jameson place, Thomas made a mental note to send word to Sheriff Coleman about Jake's body, though he doubted anyone would mourn the man's passing. The ride back to Thomas's cabin took twice as long as usual, with Thomas stopping frequently to make sure Lizzie was holding up. She was tougher than she looked, but the ordeal had taken a serious toll on her strength. As they crested the final hill before Thomas's homestead, Lizzie suddenly gasped and pointed ahead. "There in the window, is that—" Thomas smiled, seeing what she had seen, Annie's small face pressed against the cabin window, her eyes wide with hope and disbelief. "That's your daughter," Thomas confirmed. "She never stopped believing you'd come back." Lizzie began crying again, but these were tears of pure joy. As they approached the cabin, the door flew open and Annie burst out, still carrying Bobby, her face radiant with happiness. "Mama, Mama." She cried, running toward them on bare feet that seemed to barely touch the ground. Thomas helped Lizzie down from the horse, and she immediately swept both her children into her arms, holding them close, as if she'd never let them go again. Watching the reunion, Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I thought I'd lost you forever," Lizzie whispered against Annie's hair. "I'm so sorry, my darling. I'm so sorry I left you alone." "It's okay, Mama," Annie said solemnly. "Mr. Thomas took good care of us. He promised he'd find you, and he did." Lizzie looked up at Thomas over her children's heads, her eyes shining with gratitude and something deeper, something that made Thomas's heart skip a beat despite himself. "He's a good man," she said softly. "The best man I've ever known." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks and busied himself with unsaddling Buck. But inside, something warm and long dormant was stirring to life, something he'd thought died with Sarah all those years ago. As the family settled back into the cabin, Thomas found himself watching them with a mixture of contentment and uncertainty. He'd saved Lizzie Morrison and reunited her with her children, just as he'd promised Annie he would. His duty was done. So why did the thought of them leaving feel so much like losing his family all over again? The next few days passed in a blur of recovery and adjustment. Lizzie slept for nearly 18 hours straight, her body finally able to rest after the trauma of her captivity. Annie rarely left her mother's side, as if afraid she might vanish again, if not constantly watched. Baby Bobby seemed to sense the change in atmosphere and became noticeably more content sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. Thomas found his routine completely disrupted, but not unpleasantly so. The cabin that had seemed comfortable in its solitude now felt alive with voices and movement. Annie chattered constantly, telling her mother everything that had happened during her absence. How Thomas had fed Bobby with a cloth and milk, how he'd taught her to load the spare revolver, how he'd promised to find Mama no matter what. Lizzie listened to every word, her eyes never leaving her daughter's animated face. But Thomas noticed that she also watched him carefully, as if trying to understand what kind of man would go to such lengths for strangers. On the third day, when Lizzie was strong enough to move around normally, she insisted on helping with the household chores despite Thomas's protests. "You've done enough for us," she said firmly, tying one of Sarah's old aprons around her waist. "Let me earn my keep while we're here." "You don't owe me anything," Thomas replied, but he could see the stubborn set of her jaw, a look he recognized from Annie. "Maybe not in money," Lizzie said quietly. "But I owe you my life and my children's lives. That's not a debt that can ever be fully repaid, but I can at least try." As they worked together, Thomas mending harness while Lizzie prepared dinner, a comfortable routine began to develop. Annie played with Bobby on a blanket near the fire, making silly faces that sent the baby into fits of giggles. The sound of children's laughter filled corners of the cabin that had been silent for 8 years. "Annie told me about your wife," Lizzie said suddenly, her voice soft with sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss." Thomas's hands stilled on the leather he was working. "Thank you. Sarah would have liked your children. She always wanted little ones around." "What was she like?" Thomas considered how to answer. Sarah had been gone so long that sometimes her memory seemed more like a dream than reality. "Kind. Patient. She could make flowers grow in the worst soil, make me laugh when I was being too serious about everything." He looked up at Lizzie, surprised by how easy it was to talk about Sarah with her. "She would have helped you just like I did. Probably would have done it better." Lizzie shook her head. "I don't think anyone could have done it better. You saved us all, Thomas. Don't minimize that." The use of his first name sent an unexpected warmth through Thomas's chest. Most people called him McCready or Tom, only Sarah had ever called him Thomas in quite that way. That evening, as they sat around the fire after dinner, Annie made an announcement that caught them both off guard. "Mama, can we stay here forever?" Lizzie nearly choked on her coffee. "Annie, sweetheart, we can't impose on Mr. Thomas indefinitely. He has his own life to live. But why can't we all live together?" Annie persisted with the logic of childhood. "There's room for everybody, and Bobby likes it here, and Mr. Thomas doesn't mind, do you, Mr. Thomas?" Thomas found both Morrison women looking at him expectantly. Annie with hopeful enthusiasm. Lizzie with obvious embarrassment and something that might have been wistful longing. Thomas started, then stopped, unsure how to navigate these suddenly treacherous waters. "I mean, you're welcome to stay as long as you need to get back on your feet." It wasn't exactly an answer to Annie's question, But it was all Thomas felt safe offering. The truth was, the thought of the cabin returning to its former silence filled him with dread. But what could he offer Lizzie Morrison? He was a middle-aged widower, with a modest homestead and few prospects. She was a beautiful young woman, who deserved so much more than a life of hard work and isolation. "We'll find our own place soon," Lizzie said firmly, though Thomas caught the slight tremor in her voice. "I've got some sewing skills, and now that Jake is gone, I should be able to find work in town." But even as she spoke, they all knew the reality of the situation. Single women with children faced an uphill battle on the frontier, especially when they had no family connections or financial resources. The jobs available to women like Lizzie were few and poorly paid, and the constant threat of men like Jake Rawlings was always present. Later that night, after Annie and Bobby had been tucked into their makeshift bed near the fire, Thomas found himself alone with Lizzie for the first time since he'd rescued her. She was sitting at his small table mending one of Annie's dresses by lamplight, her face serene in concentration. "Lizzie," he said quietly, not wanting to wake the children, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, her needle suspended in mid-stitch. "Of course." "Annie's father, what happened to him?" Lizzie's face closed off slightly, but after a moment she sighed and set down her sewing. "His name was David Morrison. We met in Missouri before the war. He was charming, I suppose. Handsome, certainly. Said all the right things to a naive girl who thought love conquered everything." Thomas waited, sensing there was more to the story. "We married when I was 17. For a while it was good, or I thought it was. David had big dreams, always talked about the fortune we'd make out west. But he also had big debts and bigger appetites for whiskey and gambling." Lizzie's voice grew quieter, more distant. "When Annie was born, I thought having a child would settle him down. Instead, it seemed to make him worse. He'd disappear for days at a time, come back with empty pockets and wild stories about where the money had gone." "What changed?" Thomas asked gently. "I got pregnant again." Lizzie's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach. "David was furious. Said we couldn't afford another mouth to feed. He wanted me to take care of it." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "When I refused, he hit me. Hard enough to knock me down." Thomas felt familiar anger building in his chest. "Did he hurt Annie?" "Never directly. But she saw him hit me, heard him yelling about how we were all burdens he'd be better off without." Lizzie picked up her sewing again, her hands trembling slightly. "One morning I woke up and he was gone. Took everything of value we had, my mother's jewelry, the little bit of money I'd saved, even Annie's doll that had belonged to my grandmother. And you never saw him again?" Lizzie shook her head. "That was 6 months ago. A month later, I heard from a traveling merchant that David had been killed in a saloon fight in Colorado Territory. Something about cheating at cards." Thomas processed this information, understanding now why Annie had been so evasive about her father. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "No woman should have to face that alone." "I'm not sorry he's gone," Lizzie said with surprising firmness. "I'm only sorry Annie had to see what kind of man he really was. She tries to pretend she doesn't remember, but children see everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and Bobby's soft breathing. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "Lizzie, I want you to know what I said earlier about staying as long as you need. I meant it. There's no pressure to leave, no timeline you have to meet. This is a big territory and there's room for all of us." Lizzie looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thomas, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Those children have been through enough upheaval. If they're settled here, if they feel safe, then maybe that's where they should stay. And what about me? Lizzie's voice was barely audible. What about what I should do? Thomas felt his heart racing, knowing he was about to step over a line he could never uncross. I think you should do whatever makes you happy. And if staying here with me would make you happy, then that's what I think you should do. Lizzie stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Thomas, you barely know me. What if I'm not the person you think I am? What if I disappoint you? What if you don't? Thomas countered gently. What if we're both too scared of being hurt again to take a chance on something good? Before Lizzie could answer, Annie's voice piped up from across the room, thick with sleep, but clearly audible. Mama, are you going to marry Mr. Thomas? Both adults froze, realizing that little pitchers had big ears, even when they appeared to be sleeping. Lizzie's face turned bright red, but Thomas found himself smiling. Go back to sleep, Annie, he called softly. Grown-ups are talking. But are you? Annie persisted, sitting up now with her hair sticking up at impossible angles. 'Cause if you are, I think it's a real good idea. Bobby likes Mr. Thomas better than anybody, and he makes you smile, Mama. You haven't smiled much since Papa went away. Thomas felt his chest tighten at the simple honesty in the child's voice, out of the mouths of babes. Annie Morrison, that's quite enough, Lizzie said, but there was more affection than reproof in her tone. Some things are private discussions between adults. But I'm part of this family too, Annie said with 8-year-old logic. Don't I get a say in who's going to be my new papa? The word papa hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd never expected to be anyone's father, had made his peace with a solitary life. But looking at Annie's hopeful face, at Bobby sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle, at Lizzie's conflicted expression, Thomas realized his peace had been more like resignation, and resignation was a poor substitute for love. Annie, he said carefully, if your mama and I were to get married, would you want me to be your papa? Annie nodded vigorously. Oh yes, you're the best papa I could ever want. You're kind and brave, and you keep us safe, and you don't yell or hit or break things when you're mad. The casual reference to her biological father's behavior made Thomas's jaw clench, but he kept his voice gentle. Those are all things papas should do, sweetheart. But there's more to it than that. Being a real family means we stick together no matter what, through good times and bad times, when we're happy and when we're scared or sad. It means we take care of each other forever. I know, Annie said solemnly. That's what I want. Don't you want it too, Mama? All eyes turned to Lizzie, who looked like she was struggling between hope and fear. Thomas could see the battle playing out on her face, the desire for safety and stability, warring with the terror of trusting another man with her heart and her children's futures. Lizzie started, then stopped. She looked at Thomas, really looked at him as if trying to see into his soul. Thomas, are you certain marriage is... It's permanent. There's no going back if you change your mind. I'm certain, Thomas said without hesitation. I've been alone for 8 years, and I thought that was what I wanted. But these past few days have shown me what I've been missing. I want to wake up to children's voices and go to sleep knowing my family is safe under my roof. I want to be the man Annie thinks I am and the husband you deserve. Lizzie's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling now. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Thomas McCready, I'll marry you. If you're sure you can handle 2 stubborn Morrison women and a baby who's going to keep you up nights. I'm sure, Thomas said, standing up and crossing to her chair. He took her hands in his, marveling at how small and delicate they were, how they'd endured so much hardship. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Annie let out a whoop of joy that woke Bobby, who immediately began crying. But for once the sound seemed celebratory rather than distressing. Well, when can we have the wedding? Annie demanded, bouncing on her makeshift bed. Can I wear Mama's good dress? Can Bobby be the ring bearer? Can we have cake? Thomas and Lizzie looked at each other and burst out laughing, the first completely carefree laughter either had experienced in years. "Slow down there, little one," Thomas said, still chuckling. "We've got plenty of time to plan everything properly." But as he looked around at his transformed cabin, at Annie's bright face, at baby Bobby gurgling contentedly in Lizzie's arms, at the woman who would soon be his wife, Thomas realized that the planning had already begun, and the moment he'd opened his door to two desperate children on a storm-lashed night. Some families were born, others were chosen, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, they chose you right back. The wedding took place 3 weeks later on a crisp January morning, when the prairie sparkled with frost and the sky stretched endlessly blue above them. Thomas had wanted to wait longer to give Lizzie time to be absolutely certain of her decision. But she'd insisted that waiting would only give the town gossips more ammunition. Besides, she'd said with a smile that made his heart skip, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The ceremony was held in the little whitewashed church in Millbrook, with most of the town in attendance, some out of genuine goodwill, others out of curiosity about the unusual courtship. Thomas wore his best suit, the one he'd been married to Sarah in all those years ago, while Lizzie looked radiant in a blue dress borrowed from Martha at the boarding house. Annie stood as her mother's maid of honor, having insisted that she was old enough for such an important job. She carried baby Bobby during the ceremony, whispering to him throughout about how they were getting a new papa. And weren't they the luckiest babies in the whole world? Pastor Williams, a kindly man in his 60s who'd known Thomas since he first arrived in Kansas, kept the ceremony simple but meaningful. When he asked Thomas if he would take Elizabeth Morrison to be his lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish her in sickness and in health, for better or worse, Thomas's voice rang clear and strong through the small church. "I will." When the same question was posed to Lizzie, her voice was softer, but no less certain. "I will." The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and sweet, witnessed by Annie's delighted giggle and Bobby's perfectly timed coo of approval. The reception, such as it was, took place at Martha's boarding house, where the kind woman had insisted on providing a proper wedding cake and enough food to feed the small crowd of well-wishers. Thomas found himself surrounded by neighbors he'd barely spoken to in years, all offering congratulations and advice about married life. But it was Sheriff Coleman's grudging words that meant the most to him. "Tom, I gotta admit, I had my doubts about this whole situation," the older man said quietly, watching Annie help serve cake to the other children. "Thought you might be making a mistake taking on a ready-made family like this. But seeing you all together, well, it's clear you found something special." Thomas nodded his eyes, finding Lizzie across the room where she was accepting congratulations from the church ladies. Even surrounded by people, she seemed to sense his gaze and looked up smiling with such warmth and love that it took his breath away. "Sheriff Twarswars," Thomas said quietly, "sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never see coming." As the afternoon wore on and the celebration began to wind down, Thomas noticed a stranger at the edge of the crowd, a well-dressed man in his 30s with dark hair and calculating eyes, who seemed to be paying particular attention to Lizzie and the children. Thomas made his way over to the man, his instincts on alert. "Don't believe we've met. I'm Thomas McCready." The stranger turned, extending a hand, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Congratulations on your wedding, Mr. McCready. I'm Jonathan Hartley, attorney at law from Kansas City. I was hoping to have a word with your new wife about a legal matter." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What kind of legal matter?" Hartley's smile became more practiced, more professional. "I'm afraid it concerns her late husband's estate. There are some complications that need to be resolved." Before Thomas could respond, Lizzie appeared at his side, having noticed the conversation. Her face went pale when she saw Hartley. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Morrison, or should I say Mrs. McCready now. I've been looking for you for quite some time." We need to discuss your husband's debts and certain claims against his property." "I don't understand," Thomas interjected, moving protectively closer to Lizzie. "The man's been dead for months. What kind of claims?" Hartley's expression grew grave. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. McCready. David Morrison isn't dead. He's very much alive, and he's been looking for his wife and children." The words hit like a thunderbolt. Lizzie swayed on her feet, and Thomas caught her arm to steady her. Around them, the cheerful buzz of conversation continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their corner. "That's impossible," Lizzie whispered. "I heard he was killed in Colorado. A saloon fight. A case of mistaken identity, I'm afraid. The man who died was carrying your husband's identification, but it wasn't actually him. David Morrison is alive, Mrs. McCready, and he's hired me to help him reclaim what's rightfully his." Thomas felt the world tilting around him. Reclaim what? Hartley's eyes moved meaningfully to Annie, who was playing with Bobby near the cake table, blissfully unaware of the conversation taking place. His children, Mr. McCready, and his wife. The rest of the conversation passed in a blur of legal terminology and veiled threats. Hartley explained that David Morrison had spent the past 6 months tracking down his family, that he claimed Lizzie had stolen his children when she left Missouri, that he was prepared to take legal action to get them back. "Of course," Hartley said smoothly. "Mr. Morrison is a reasonable man. He understands that his wife may have formed attachments during his absence. He's prepared to be generous in his forgiveness, provided she returns to him voluntarily and brings the children." "And if she doesn't?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we'll be forced to pursue other remedies. The law is quite clear about a man's rights regarding his wife and children, Mr. McCready, even in Kansas." As Hartley took his leave, pressing a business card into Lizzie's trembling hand, Thomas felt their perfect day crumbling around them. The marriage they'd just celebrated might not even be legal if Lizzie's first husband was still alive. And worse, the man who'd abandoned and abused his family was now trying to reclaim them through legal manipulation. That evening, back at the cabin that no longer felt quite like home, Thomas and Lizzie sat before the fire while Annie and Bobby slept peacefully nearby. The events of the day seemed like a nightmare from which they couldn't wake. "I don't understand," Lizzie said for the 10th time. "The merchant who told me about David's death, he seemed so certain. He described the clothes, the scar on David's hand. Hartley said the dead man was carrying your husband's papers. It's possible David set up the whole thing, deliberately wanted people to think he was dead." Lizzie looked up sharply. But why would he do that? Thomas had been thinking about this question all evening, and he didn't like the conclusions he'd reached. Maybe he was in trouble, gambling debts, legal problems, someone wanting to kill him. Faking his death would give him time to disappear, start over somewhere else. Then why come back now? Why not just stay dead? "Because," Thomas said grimly, "he's found out that his widow has remarried a man with property and prospects. Suddenly his children are worth something again. The implications hung heavy between them. If David Morrison was truly alive, then Lizzie's marriage to Thomas was invalid. Worse, in the eyes of the law, she was an adulteress who had abandoned her legal husband, and her children could be taken from her as punishment." "Thomas," Lizzie said quietly, "maybe I should go with him, if it means keeping Annie and Bobby safe." "No." Thomas's voice was firm. "We'll find another way." "What other way? You heard what that lawyer said. The law is on David's side." Thomas stared into the fire, his mind racing through possibilities. "Laws can be challenged. We'll get our own lawyer, fight this thing properly. With what money? And even if we could afford it, how long would it take? David could petition the court to take the children while the case is pending." Thomas felt helpless rage building in his chest. After everything they'd been through, after building a life together, It could all be torn away by a man who'd never shown any real love for his family. There has to be something, he insisted. Some way to prove that David forfeited his rights when he abandoned you. Lizzie was quiet for a long moment, staring at her sleeping children. When she spoke, her voice was filled with a determination Thomas had never heard before. Thomas, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you before we married. Thomas felt his stomach clench. What is it? David didn't just abandon us. He tried to hurt me badly before he left. And Annie saw it happen. Thomas waited, sensing there was more. She's never talked about it, but sometimes she has nightmares. She screams in her sleep about bad papa and blood on mama's dress. Lizzie's voice broke slightly. Thomas, if David takes her back, if he gets angry about her being with us, I don't think she could survive it. And I know I couldn't live with myself for letting it happen. The words crystallized something in Thomas's mind, a desperate, dangerous plan that went against everything he believed about law and order. But that might be their only hope. Lizzie, he said carefully, what if David Morrison really was dead? What if Hartley was lying or mistaken, and we could prove it? Lizzie looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Thomas met her gaze steadily. I mean that sometimes bad men get what they deserve, especially out here where the law is thin, and justice has to be made, rather than waited for. Understanding dawned in Lizzie's eyes, along with fear. Thomas, no. I won't let you risk yourself for us. We'll find another way. What other way? Thomas echoed her earlier words. You said it yourself, the law is on his side. But the law assumes David Morrison is a decent man who deserves to have his family back. What if we could prove he's not? Before Lizzie could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze, the unmistakable creak of someone stepping onto the front porch. Thomas was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle that hung above the fireplace. But before he could reach it, a familiar voice called out, Thomas, it's me, Annie, I couldn't sleep. Thomas relaxed, moving to open the door for the little girl. But as he lifted the latch, the door suddenly burst inward with tremendous force, sending him staggering backward. 3 men pushed into the cabin, and Thomas's blood ran cold as he recognized the leader. David Morrison was smaller than Thomas had expected, probably no more than 5'8". But he carried himself with the aggressive confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and his clothes were expensive but flashy. Everything about him screamed gambler and confidence man. Oh, well, well. David said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. What a cozy little scene. My wife playing house with another man. Annie had scrambled behind Thomas at the first sign of trouble. But at the sound of that voice, she let out a small, terrified whimper that cut through Thomas like a knife. Papa, she whispered, and the fear in that single word told Thomas everything he needed to know about David Morrison's true character. Hello, Annie girl, David said with false joviality. Did you miss your papa? I've been looking everywhere for you and your mama and little Bobby. Thomas moved protectively in front of both Lizzie and Annie, his mind calculating odds and distances. 3 against 1, and he was unarmed, while they all carried visible weapons. Not good odds, but he'd faced worse in the war. You're not welcome here, Morrison, Thomas said evenly. I suggest you leave. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Leave? This is rich. You steal my wife and children, and then you have the gall to tell me to leave? I didn't steal anything. Your wife was told you were dead. She mourned you properly, then chose to marry me of her own free will. Her own free will. David's eyes glittered with malice. Is that what she told you? Did she mention that she's a whore who spread her legs for half the men in Missouri before I was fool enough to marry her? That's enough, Thomas snapped, but David was just getting started. Did she tell you how she tried to kill me, Came at me with a kitchen knife one night, screaming about how she wished I was dead. Had to knock some sense into her, if you know what I mean. Behind Thomas, he heard Lizzie's sharp intake of breath, but he didn't dare turn around. David's two companions, rough-looking men who had the look of hired guns, were spreading out trying to flank him. "The only thing I know," Thomas said carefully, "is that you abandoned your family and left them to starve. That makes you less than nothing in my book." David's face darkened with rage. "You sanctimonious bastard. You think you're better than me. You think you can just take what's mine and there won't be consequences. I think," Thomas said quietly, "that a man who threatens children and hits women isn't much of a man at all." The words had the desired effect. David's control snapped, and he lunged forward with a snarl of rage. Thomas was ready for him, sidestepping the clumsy attack and landing a solid right cross that sent David staggering backward into one of his companions. But the momentary advantage didn't last. The second hired gun clubbed Thomas from behind, with the butt of his pistol sending stars exploding across his vision. As he fell to his knees, struggling to stay conscious, he heard Lizzie scream and Annie crying. "You get your hands off them!" Thomas roared, trying to get back to his feet, but another blow to the head sent him sprawling. When his vision cleared, David was holding a gun on him, while his men restrained Lizzie and Annie. Baby Bobby, awakened by the commotion, was crying loudly from his cradle. "Here's how this is going to work." David said, his voice cold and businesslike now. "My dear wife is going to pack up her things and our children, and we're all going to take a nice trip back to Missouri. You, on the other hand, are going to forget this whole unfortunate episode ever happened." "Like hell." Thomas gasped, blood running down his face from the head wounds. David smiled and cocked his pistol. "Oh, but you are. Because if you try to follow us, if you go to the law, if you so much as breathe our names again, I'll make sure something very unfortunate happens to little Annie here. Children have such terrible accidents sometimes, don't they?" The casual cruelty in David's voice was worse than any physical blow. Thomas looked at Annie, saw the terror in her young face, and felt something break inside him. "Please," he said, abandoning pride for the sake of the children. "Take your wife if you must, but leave the children here. They're safe here, they're happy." "They're mine," David snapped. "My property just like she is, and I don't leave my property behind for other men to use." As David's men began forcing Lizzie to pack their few belongings, Thomas caught her eye and saw desperation there that matched his own. They both knew that if David succeeded in taking Annie and Bobby, the children would be in constant danger from a man who saw them as tools to control their mother. But Thomas also saw something else in Lizzie's face, a barely perceptible nod toward the kitchen area, where he suddenly remembered his spare revolver lay hidden in a flour barrel. If he could create a distraction, get to the weapon. "Morrison," Thomas said loudly, struggling to his feet despite the gun trained on him. "Before you take them, there's something you should know. Something about your son." David frowned, momentarily distracted. "What about him?" "He's not yours," Thomas said bluntly. "Count the months, David. Your wife was already pregnant when you left. That baby was conceived after you abandoned them." It was a desperate lie, but it had the desired effect. David's face went white with rage, and he turned toward Bobby's cradle with murderous intent. "You lying whore," he screamed at Lizzie. "Whose bastard is that?" In the moment of chaos that followed, David shouting, his men distracted Lizzie, crying out in protest. Thomas made his move. He dove toward the kitchen area, his hand closing around the hidden revolver, just as David realized what was happening. "Kill him," David shouted, but Thomas was already rolling, bringing the gun up as David's men tried to draw their own weapons. The first shot took down the man closest to Annie, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying. The second shot shattered David's gun hand, causing him to drop his weapon with a scream of pain. The third man got his gun clear and fired the bullet, burning across Thomas's shoulder. But Thomas's return shot was more accurate, catching the hired gun center mass and dropping him like a stone. In the sudden silence that followed, David Morrison sat on the floor, clutching his ruined hand, blood seeping between his fingers. His two companions were either dead or dying, their weapons scattered across the cabin floor. "It's over, David," Thomas said, keeping the revolver trained on the wounded man. "Your reign of terror ends here." But David wasn't finished. With his good hand, he pulled a hidden knife from his boot and lunged toward Annie, who was frozen with terror near the wall. "If I can't have them, nobody can," he screamed. Thomas fired without hesitation, the bullet taking David Morrison in the chest and slamming him backward. The knife clattered harmlessly across the floor as David gasped out his life, his eyes wide with surprise and rage, until they saw nothing at all. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Annie ran to Thomas, throwing her small arms around his waist and sobbing against his shirt. Lizzie gathered up Bobby, checking frantically to make sure he wasn't hurt, while Thomas surveyed the carnage in his once peaceful cabin. "Is it over?" Lizzie asked quietly. "Is he really dead this time?" Thomas checked David's pulse, then nodded grimly. "It's over. He can't hurt you anymore." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas knew the complications were just beginning. 3 men were dead in his cabin, including David Morrison. There would be questions from the law investigations, possibly a trial. However, as he looked at Annie's tear-stained face and heard Bobby's healthy cries, Thomas realized he didn't care about the complications. He'd saved his family, and that was all that mattered. "Thomas," Lizzie said softly, "what do we tell Annie? How do we explain all this?" Thomas knelt down to Annie's level, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Annie, sweetheart, your father was a sick man. He was angry and hurt people, and that's not okay. Sometimes when someone tries to hurt the people we love, we have to stop them. Do you understand?" Annie nodded solemnly. "He was bad, wasn't he, like the man who took Mama before?" "Yes, sweetheart, he was bad, but he can't hurt anyone anymore." "Good," Annie said with surprising firmness. "I don't want him to hurt Mama or Bobby or you." As Thomas held his stepdaughter close, feeling her small body trembling with leftover fear, he made a silent promise. Whatever legal consequences he faced for tonight's actions, whatever questions were asked or charges brought, he would make sure this family stayed together and stayed safe. Because sometimes out on the frontier where law was scarce and justice was hard to find, a man had to make his own rules and live with the consequences. And Thomas McCready could live with protecting the people he loved, no matter what it cost him. The aftermath of that violent night stretched into weeks of uncertainty and legal complications. Sheriff Coleman arrived the next morning with the town doctor, drawn by reports of gunshots from neighboring homesteads. What he found was a scene of obvious self-defense, 3 dead men, including David Morrison, and a family that had clearly been defending themselves against armed intruders. The evidence was overwhelming in Thomas's favor. David's 2 hired guns were known criminals with bounties on their heads in 2 states. Morrison himself had been carrying forged identification papers and a significant amount of stolen money. Most importantly, Annie's tearful but clear testimony about her father's threats and violent behavior sealed the case. Self-defense, plain and simple, Sheriff Coleman declared after 3 days of investigation. Morrison and his men broke into your home, threatened your family, and got what they deserved. But the legal complexities didn't end there. Hartley, the lawyer who had claimed to represent David Morrison, disappeared overnight, leaving behind questions about his true identity and motives. It eventually came to light that he was actually a confidence man, working with David in an elaborate scheme to extort money from Lizzie by threatening to take her children. The revelation that David Morrison had been involved in multiple criminal enterprises across 3 states helped explain his mysterious death and resurrection. He'd been running from both the law and various criminal associates, using his wife and children as both cover and leverage in his schemes. "You know what I think," Sheriff Coleman said one afternoon as he sat in Thomas's cabin sharing coffee and watching Annie play with Bobby. "I think that bastard Morrison never intended to actually take his family back. I think he planned to use them to shake you down for money, then disappear again." Thomas nodded grimly. "The question is, how many other families has he done this to?" As winter deepened into spring, the McCready family slowly healed from their ordeal. Annie, resilient as children often are, seemed to recover quickly once she understood that the threat was truly over. She threw herself into helping care for Bobby and learning the countless skills required for frontier life. Thomas marveled at her adaptability and intelligence. She could already read simple words and had an intuitive understanding of numbers that made managing the household accounts a pleasure rather than a chore. More importantly, she had begun calling him Papa, naturally without prompting or awkwardness. Bobby, meanwhile, was thriving in ways that broke Thomas's heart with joy. The baby had grown chubby and healthy under their care, his smiles and giggles filling the cabin with warmth. When he took his first steps in early April, walking straight into Thomas's outstretched arms, even Lizzie cried with happiness. But it was the change in Lizzie herself that moved Thomas most profoundly. The frightened, desperate woman he'd first rescued had blossomed into a confident wife and mother who laughed easily and loved fiercely. The shadows in her eyes had gradually faded, replaced by a contentment and security she'd never known before. "Sometimes, I can't believe this is real," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching Annie chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "After so many years of being afraid of never knowing what tomorrow would bring, now I wake up every morning knowing I'm loved and safe." Thomas reached over and took her hand, marveling as always at how perfectly it fit in his. "You are loved," he said simply, "more than you know." As summer arrived and the prairie bloomed with wildflowers, the McCready family settled into the rhythm of their new life. Thomas expanded his cattle operation with profits from selling David Morrison's stolen money to the territorial marshal after keeping enough to pay for legal expenses and improvements to the homestead. Annie appointed herself chief assistant in all ranch operations, following Thomas around with endless questions about everything from cattle breeding to weather prediction. Her quick mind and fearless spirit reminded him daily of what a gift he'd been given when she knocked on his door that storm-lashed night. "Papa," she asked one afternoon as they mended fence together, "do you think bad men always get punished like my first papa did?" Thomas considered the question carefully. Annie deserved honesty, but she also deserved hope. "Not always, sweetheart," he said finally. "Sometimes bad men get away with doing bad things, and that's not fair. But I believe that if we're brave and stand up for what's right, justice usually finds a way." Annie nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I'm glad you were brave, Papa. I'm glad you saved us." "I'm glad too, Annie girl. More glad than I can ever tell you." As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Pastor Williams rode out to the homestead on a crisp October morning, his face bright with excitement. "Thomas, Lizzie, I have wonderful news," he announced as they gathered around the kitchen table. "The territorial governor has officially appointed you as deputy marshal for this district. The salary isn't much, but it comes with authority to keep the peace across 100 square miles. Thomas felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Pastor, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of responsibility." "Nonsense," Pastor Williams replied firmly. "You've already proven you can handle the worst kinds of criminals. And with your military experience and natural sense of justice, you're exactly what this territory needs." Lizzie reached over and squeezed Thomas's hand. "I think you should do it," she said quietly. "You have a gift for protecting people, for standing up to bullies and criminals. Maybe it's time to use that gift to help more families like ours." Thomas looked around the table at his family, at Annie's eager face, at Bobby babbling happily in his high chair, at Lizzie's supportive smile, and felt something settle into place inside him. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it. But this homestead stays our home base. I won't take a job that keeps me away from my family more than necessary." That evening, as they celebrated Thomas's appointment with a special dinner, Annie made an announcement that surprised them all. "I've been thinking," she said with 8-year-old seriousness, "about what I want to be when I grow up." "And what's that, sweetheart?" Lizzie asked. "I want to be a teacher. Like Miss Sarah in town, but better. I want to teach children who don't have schools nearby, maybe travel around in a wagon with books and slates and everything they need to learn." Thomas felt his chest swell with pride. "That's a wonderful dream, Annie. Education is one of the most important things you can give people." "I know," Annie said confidently. "You and Mama taught me that. And if children are smart and educated, maybe they won't be scared of bad men anymore. Maybe they'll know how to stand up for themselves." As winter returned to the Kansas prairie, the McCready family faced their first full year together with confidence and joy. Thomas had successfully handled 3 cases as deputy marshal, earning respect throughout the territory for his fair but firm approach to law enforcement. Lizzie had started a small business, making and selling quilts to families throughout the region, her artistic skills and attention to detail making her work highly sought after. The extra income allowed them to make improvements to the homestead and put aside money for Annie's education. Annie herself continued to amaze everyone with her quick learning and mature insights. She could now read as well as many adults and had developed a particular fascination with geography and natural science. Thomas had ordered books from Kansas City specifically to challenge her growing intellect. Bobby, meanwhile, had grown into a sturdy toddler who followed Annie everywhere and called Thomas Papa with complete naturalness. Watching the little boy play with blocks or chase the barn cats, Thomas often marveled at how quickly children could heal from trauma when surrounded by love and security. On Christmas Eve, 1848, exactly 1 year after their first meeting, the McCready family gathered around their decorated tree, a small pine Thomas had cut from the creek bottom, and Annie had covered with handmade ornaments and candles. "I have something for all of you," Thomas announced, pulling out 3 wrapped packages. "But first, I want to say something." Annie and Bobby looked up expectantly, while Lizzie waited with a gentle smile. "A year ago, I thought my life was complete. I had my work, my land, my solitude. I thought that was enough." Thomas's voice grew thick with emotion. "But you 3 taught me the difference between existing and living. You taught me that love multiplied doesn't get smaller, it gets bigger. And you taught me that families aren't just born, sometimes they're built one act of kindness at a time." He handed Annie her package first. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal with her name embossed in gold letters. "For writing down all your thoughts and dreams," Thomas explained. "And for recording your adventures when you become that traveling teacher." Annie hugged the journal to her chest, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Thank you, Papa. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." Bobby's gift was a hand-carved wooden horse with wheels painted in bright colors. The toddler immediately began pushing it around the floor, making galloping sounds that filled the cabin with laughter. But it was Lizzie's gift that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Thomas handed her a small velvet box inside which lay a simple gold ring set with a single perfect diamond. "I know we're already married," Thomas said softly, "but I wanted you to have a proper wedding ring. Something beautiful to match the beautiful life we've built together." Lizzie's tears flowed freely as Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger beside the simple gold band from their wedding. "Thomas, it's magnificent. But you didn't need to." "Yes, I did," Thomas interrupted gently. "You deserve beautiful things, Lizzie. You deserve to be treasured and honored and loved every single day of your life. As they exchanged gifts and shared stories by the firelight, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. A desperate knock on a storm-lashed door had changed everything, transforming his lonely existence into a life filled with purpose and love. Annie fell asleep first, curled up on the rug, with her new journal clutched in her arms. Bobby followed soon after, exhausted from playing with his wooden horse. Thomas carried both children to their beds, while Lizzie banked the fire for the night. "Thomas," Lizzie said softly as they prepared for sleep, "do you ever regret it, taking us and changing your whole life for 3 strangers?" Thomas pulled her close, marveling as always at how perfectly she fit against his side. "Regret loving you. Regret being Annie's papa and Bobby's papa. Regret having a family that fills my heart every single day." He kissed the top of her head gently. "Never, Lizzie. Not for 1 second of one day. Even when we're loud and messy and Annie asks a million questions and Bobby gets into everything," Thomas chuckled. "Especially then. That's when I know we're really alive." As sleep took them, Thomas listened to the familiar sounds of his family, Lizzie's gentle breathing, Bobby's soft sighs from his crib, Annie's occasional murmur from across the room. Outside, the Kansas wind sang its eternal song across the prairie. But inside their cabin, all was warmth and peace and love. 3 years later, Deputy Marshal Thomas McCready sat on his front porch, watching his son Bobby, now 4 years old, chase chickens around the yard, while his 11-year-old daughter Annie helped her mother hang laundry on the line. A new addition to the family baby, Sarah Elizabeth, born the previous spring, slept peacefully in a cradle beside Thomas's chair. The homestead had grown and prospered. Thomas's cattle operation now supplied beef to 3 counties, while Lizzie's quilting business had expanded to include teaching sewing skills to young women throughout the territory. Annie had tested into advanced classes despite her age and was already talking about attending the new teachers' college being established in Topeka. "Papa," Bobby called out, running toward the porch with his arms full of eggs. "Look what I found. The hens were hiding them everywhere." Thomas smiled, remembering another child who had run to him with such excitement, seeking safety and love in a world that had offered her precious little of either. "Good work, son," he said, ruffling Bobby's hair. "Your mama will be pleased to have those for breakfast tomorrow." As the family gathered for their evening meal, Thomas looked around the table at the faces he loved most in the world and felt his heart overflow with gratitude. His life had been forever changed by a desperate knock on a storm-lashed door, by the courage of a little girl who refused to let her baby brother die, by the grace of second chances, and the power of choosing to love. Annie said grace that evening, her young voice clear and strong. "Thank you, God, for this food for our home, for keeping us safe and together. Thank you for bringing Papa to us when we needed him most, and for teaching us that families are made of love, not just blood. Amen." "Amen," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Outside, the prairie wind sang its eternal song, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. But inside the McCready cabin, surrounded by the laughter and chatter of his chosen family, Thomas knew he had already found everything he would ever need. Some stories end with grand gestures and dramatic revelations. But the best stories, the ones that really matter, end with ordinary moments that feel extraordinary because they're shared with people you love. And in a modest cabin on the Kansas prairie, where a lonely rancher had once opened his door to desperate strangers, love had indeed conquered all.